Is there anything we did not cover we want to cover in more detail?
One thing that I would point out when Amanda was talking about the weighted funding formula, one of the things that's in the bill that I think is good, as funding changes going upward, or if unfortunately if the economy has a downturn and it goes down, it will still maintain that differential between base funding and weighted funding. So they won't either take weighted funding away to raise the base or cut the base further to raise. So I think that keeping that balance of the differential, because we know that it does take different resources to educate certain populations. So I think that's an important piece that's in there.
Huh, okay. Yeah, we didn't really talk too much in detail about base and weighted. Maybe we can just do an overview of that. Amanda, what is the difference between the base and a weighted formula?
Yeah, so base funding is basically the funding any general education student would get, or any student. So it's just kind of the operational expenses, paying for the teacher and the principal and the staff and all those kind of basic things in the school. Under SB 543, weighted funding will be used for things that they're calling Zoom services or Victory services. So if you're familiar with Zoom schools and Victory schools, these are schools that were serving high English learner populations or high at-risk populations. So now those kind of services that we've seen be successful in those schools, now they're, in theory, if there's the money provided for those weights, they'd be provided to all students that qualify under those categories. And we currently do have weighted funding for students with disabilities, so that will continue, and we'll now have weighted funding for students who are gifted and talented. So it's putting in law these programs, and they're going to be part of the formula, whereas before it was kind of every 2 years, we hope that particular program will get funded, but it wasn't really part of the formula. So it's a good step, but without additional dollars to actually put into those weights, it's going to be very difficult to provide those services.
And Emil, I wonder, do we have ratios on what those are for each one of those populations then? Are those detailed in the bill?
Oh, for Zoom and Victory services and whatnot, or?
Correct. Yep.
I'm not sure that they're detailed in the bill exactly. There's a lot of details that have yet to be worked out.
I know they've roughly calculated what they want those weights to be, but whether they're in the bill.
That'll be, again, up for a decision later on.
And that's the big part of what the Commission on School Funding, I think is what they're calling it, is going to be doing, is setting those weights, actually setting the base per pupil amount, all the adjustments that you started having with the necessarily small schools, the small districts. So that's how you get the differential between the districts within the state. And then this Commission on School Funding will also look to see how much money they have available to distribute via the weights, and then determine what the weighted amounts will be. So I think, again, going back to the presentation that we saw the other day, when you explain this funding bill, it really helps to have those numbers there to understand the implications of what's happening, but it's important to note that the bill doesn't actually specify any of those, that they're for illustrative purposes only.
Right, right. So a lot of weight's falling on this commission, it sounds like. Is there any language in the bill that gives any type of definition on who these commission members are going to be? Are they going to be educators, business people, anything like that? Any detail whatsoever? Amanda?
It does list some categories.
Yeah, I think they're looking for folks who have an education background and a fiscal background. And I know there's 4 CFOs that will be assigned to the commission, 2 from rural counties, 2 from urban counties. So Clark and Washoe are only 2 urban counties. And they'll be deciding kind of the technical details. I think they're envisioning this as, from what I understand from hearing Jeremy's presentation, a very technical committee. So I think they're trying to avoid having, business leaders or things like that, unless they have that education and fiscal background. But they don't want it to be a political committee or, a business committee or even a teacher committee. It looks like they're trying to have kind of a fiscal expert committee. And I know that there has been some pushback on that membership, and I don't know if that'll end up being changed. There's also been some pushback on the authority. A lot of legislators are a little uncomfortable with the authority, it appears, based on that hearing. But that seems to be what the bill is envisioning.
Yeah. Amelia, we had a reduction in funding for safety to cover some of the expenses for increasing education funding. What are you hearing out there on the street? How is it impacting schools?
That, again, just drives back to the issue of adequacy and having enough money, period. I think I'm getting the feeling from folks, in the education field that, the governor promised these raises. Well, even with the money that you thought would cover for the raises, it's actually still not enough. But then at the same time, well, we promised this school safety account. And when you're truing up all the numbers and you're realizing I can't pay for both, right? So that's just kind of the stark reality. I know some legislators were upset that day that it got significantly cut. But the reality is you have to get the money from somewhere. And if we're not raising new revenue, then it's going to come from somewhere. You have to find it, somewhere. So that's kind of I would say the loser of all of this is just cutting that. And now Clark, and I don't know about what Washoe says, but the CCSD said the other night that they just can't pay for those safety improvements on their own. They can't pay for it out of their capital budget. They've got $6 billion in deferred maintenance needs alone for their capital budget. So those are things that need to be upgraded, things that need to be worked on so that buildings aren't literally falling apart. So that's a long way there's a long list of needs to then tack that safety thing onto too. So they just can't pay for it. So that's kind of what's important to keep in mind here.
And we're not even talking about the 3% teacher raises
exactly.
as well.
Yeah.
Covering that as well.
And I think, if I might add, the other aspect of whatever's left over at the biennium doesn't then revert to, I think, the state general fund, if I have that correctly. I'm trying to pull it out. Okay. Since I think we pulled the number since fiscal year 2000, I think something about $400 million has been reverted to the state general fund, I believe out of CCSD alone. So now at the end of each biennium, we're not giving that back to the state. The state was always very frugal with how much money they give, and if it's not trued up at the end of the biennium to be exactly what you thought you needed, then you've got to give it back to us. So now hopefully we'll start to have more of that, and as Amanda said, as the economy grows, we might be able to grow. And likewise, decline if it declines. But
right. Yep. Great. Any other comments? One of the things I wanted to touch up on is there are a lot of presidential candidates that are kind of issuing right now their own funding packages, and I know per pupil funding is being talked about, something that's going to be handled potentially by the federal government if some of our candidates become president. Is there any likelihood of that happening? Do you think? How realistic is that, Amanda?
I wouldn't hold my breath for that. We're already currently having difficulty covering all the other federal mandates. I mean, you have IDEA, which covers our special education students, and Title I and Title III, all these great federal programs, totally wholly underfunded. And it's expected of schools and districts to provide these services, which are really critical, important services, but states are often flipping the bill for that. So the idea that there's going to be a lot of money from the federal government, I would love to believe that. I hope so, but I'm not I'm not holding my breath on that.